that is happening in 2020? What kind of a decade are we up for? What's going to be going on with the portal during the coming year, coming 10 years? I think that the first thing that I want to signal is that we are finally ready to take on something which I have always found terrifying. And that has to do with idea suppression. Now, before we get to idea suppression and how it functions and what it is, I want to take new listeners through a very brief description of how we would order the world relative to the portal and its objectives. So if you will, let me take you back to the end of World War II. There's a lot of prehistory, but we can't afford to do everything. So shortly after World War II, there were two very important events in the early 1950s from our perspective. One of which was the unlocking of the three-dimensional structure of DNA by Watson and Crick in 1953. And the other was the explosions of hydrogen devices using work of Edward Teller and Stanislaw Ulam, and what that changed in the human picture, because we went from a short period where we were dealing with atomic bombs, where duck and cover was a plausible solution, to dealing with hydrogen devices in which the destructive power was really incalculable. It's the power of gods used to power the sun here on Earth. Now, to my way of thinking, since the early 1950s, there has been no comparable explosion of wisdom to go along with this newfound power that humans have, this new godlike power. So I've called this the twin nuclei problem of cell and atom. And I think what we've had is an incredible run of luck. And I think it's the most magical and marvelous thing, but I don't believe that we can count on luck forever. And in fact, given some of the events of early 2020 taking place in Iraq and Iran, I would say that history at the scale that we were accustomed to it during the let's say first half of the 20th century, could start up at any moment. And we're entirely unprepared for this. Now, in the story that has this major through line that we've been following, the next thing that happens that's really important is a guy named Derek de Sola Price starts to calculate that science is on an exponential trajectory. And rather than thinking that that's a great thing, he starts to understand that anything on an exponential trajectory can't really go on because it's going to burn itself out. And if science is the original seed corn, if you will, of technology and technology of economics, then effectively what's going to happen in science is going to percolate through a chain, through technology and into the economy, with a potential stagnation coming. Now, he started to arrive at these ideas, I think, at Yale in the late 1950s. It was not well understood what he was talking about. And still, I'm always shocked that the book Science Since Babylon, which he wrote and which discusses this issue, is so much less well known than, say, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. For some reason, this is so dispiriting to so many people that we actually don't discuss it much. Studying this work led to the idea of talking about egos, that is, embedded growth obligations. Now, embedded growth obligations are the way in which institutions plan their future predicated on legacies of growth. And since the period between the end of World War II in 1945 and the early 70s had such an unusually beautiful growth regime, many of our institutions became predicated upon low variance, technology-led, stable, broadly distributed growth. Now, this is a world we have not seen in an organic way since the early 1970s. And yet, because it was embedded in our institutions, what we have is a world in which the expectation is still present in the form of an embedded growth obligation. That is, the pension plans, the corporate ladders are all still built very much around a world that has long since vanished. We have effectively become a growth cargo cult. That is, once upon a time, planes used to land in the Pacific, let's say during World War II, and indigenous people looked at the airstrips and the behavior of the air traffic controllers, and they've been mimicking those behaviors in the years since as ritual, but the planes no longer land. Well, in large measure, our institutions are built for a world in which growth doesn't happen in the same way anymore. All right. What then happened is that a different structure, which I have termed the gated institutional narrative, came to become repurposed. Now, the gated institutional narrative is like an exchange, a financial exchange, if you will, except it's an exchange of information and ideas. And in order to actually participate in this particular special conversation, you need to have a seat on the exchange. That is, you need to write for an important paper like the Wall Street Journal, or you need to be a senator or a congressman so that you can gain access to the news media, or you need to be sitting at a news desk. In any of these situations, whether you're a professor or a reporter or a politician, if you can gain a seat inside of the gated institutional narrative, you can attempt to converse with other people within that particular conversation. The rest of us do not really have the same level or kind of access to this highly rarefied discussion. And I've previously compared this to what we would term a promotion inside of the world of professional wrestling. It's an agreed upon structure in which people often agree to simulate dispute rather than actually have disputes, because somebody could get really seriously injured. But they're in fact working together to produce an engaging and regular product for mass consumption. The problem with this gated institutional narrative is that in general, it doesn't contain the most important ideas. And that is where the gating function comes in. The most important ideas are likely to be the ideas that are most disruptive. What if the entire food pyramid, for example, was wildly off? What if fats were not the great danger we thought they were, and those waving fields of wheat that are fabled in American song, in fact, give rise to carbs, which are very dangerous to us all? So if everything were inverted, let's say, where in a world where instead of banishing volatility during the so-called Great Moderation before 2008, we were actually building the tinder for the world's largest financial forest fire. What if, in fact, we had all sorts of things exactly backwards and completely wrong? What if diversity wasn't always a sign of our strength, but sometimes a sign of our weakness? What if, for example, immigration, far from being an issue of xenophobes versus xenophiles, was actually an instrument of redistribution, having very little to do with xenophobia or xenophilia to begin with? These sorts of ideas can't be entertained inside of the gated institutional narrative. And that's where the gating function comes in. What was originally a function intended to ensure quality control of the narrative became an instrument for something else. And this is where I want to introduce the most important concept that I think we will be dealing with on a going forward basis in 2020 on this program, the DISC. What is the DISC? The DISC stands for the Distributed Idea Suppression Complex. Now, taking it apart, the center of it is idea suppression. Not all ideas are good, and so idea suppression is very frequently understood as an important concept when we're talking about something like bigotry, or we're talking about something like violent ideology. Of course, we want to suppress certain ideas. But these are not the ideas that are principally important inside of the DISC. The DISC is actually a complex. It is a large collection of different structures, and it's not controlled in any one place. Many of these have emerged separately. But what makes an aspect of the DISC, what shows you a particular component, is that it protects institutions from individuals who are making valid and reasonable points. So if you imagine that the institutions have become incredibly fragile because they're in fact built for growth, and that plan for their growth, if it obligates them to tell untruths and to hide certain characteristics because they are not in fact able to grow at the rates in which they are supposed to, you need some complex for making sure that that information doesn't reach the bottom entrance to a pyramid structure.